A man and woman went to Las Vegas for their honeymoon and checked into a suite at a hotel. When they got to their room, they both detected a bad odor. The husband called down to the front desk and asked to speak to the manager. He explained that the room smelled very bad and they would like another suite. The manager apologized and told the man that they were all booked because of a convention. He offered to send them to a restaurant of their choice for lunch, compliments of the hotel, and said he was going to send a maid up to their room to clean and to try and get rid of the odor. After a nice lunch, the couple went back to their room. When they walked in, they could both still smell the horrible odor. Again, the husband called the front desk and told the manager that the room still smelled really bad. The manager told the man that they would try and find a suite at another hotel. He called every hotel on the strip, but every hotel was sold out because of the convention. The manager told the couple that they couldn't find them a room anywhere, but they would try and clean the room again. The couple wanted to see the sights and do a little gambling anyway, so they said they would give them 2 hours to clean and then they would be back. When the couple had left, the manager and all of the housekeeping staff went to the room to try and find what was making it smell so bad. They went through the entire suite and found nothing. So the maids put in new sheets, new towels, took down the curtains and put new ones up, cleaned the carpet, and cleaned the suite again using the strongest cleaning products they had. The couple came back 2 hours later to find the room still had a bad odor. The husband was so angry at this point, he decided to find whatever the smell was himself, so he started tearing the entire suite apart. As he pulled the top mattress off the box spring of the bed, he found a dead body of a woman. Me and my wife were on our honeymoon in Hawaii. We were on the island of Oahu, sitting on the beach. My wife got up to go to the bathroom, and when she got back, she told me that there was a creepy man watching her walk into the bathroom, and when she tried to walk out, he blocked her path. She only got away because there were 2 other people walking into the bathroom, so he got out of the way. I asked her what the man looked like, and she looked over, but unfortunately, she said he was gone. Our hotel was walking distance from the beach, so we got back quickly, but we made sure to report the man to a police officer we saw walking on the beach, and then we washed up before going out to eat. We ate at a fancy seafood place and did some walking around afterwards. Close to midnight, we finally went back to the room and began to wind down. Then we got a knock at the door. I looked through the peephole of the door and saw a man in a maid uniform standing outside. I opened the door and he immediately tried to let himself in. I pushed him back a bit, asking him what he wanted. He told me he left something in the room while cleaning earlier and needed to get it out. The only thing, we left the do not disturb sign on the door all day. Then I noticed he was making eye contact with my wife. My wife then screamed, "That's the man!" I didn't understand at first, but it was too late for that. The man had already lunged at me, holding my throat with one hand while reaching behind himself with another. He pulled out a knife and started swinging at me, and if it weren't for my wife coming over and smashing his face with the lamp, I would have been as good as dead. The commotion drew out all the inhabitants of the neighboring rooms. One of the women started freaking out and screaming, making the situation worse. We called the police, and so did the hotel. It turned into a huge, horrible scene, but we were just happy to be alive. We were questioned when the police arrived, and some of the other people around us claimed to have witnessed it all. We still don't know what kind of intentions this guy had, but if I had to guess, I would say he wanted to get to my wife. He must have been one very dumb person to think he would get away with something like this in such a public building. Me, my wife, and 2 kids were taking a drive all the way down to Florida from New York to go to Disney. We were in Georgia at the time, so close to entering Florida, and it was about 11 o'clock at night. I planned on finishing the drive that night just to save the money from a night at a hotel. My wife and kids were already long asleep, so I was trying to drive as smoothly as possible. On that quiet highway at 11 o'clock, there were hardly any other cars at all. In fact, I didn't see any lights until, up in the horizon, I saw 2 flashing red lights. Not police lights, more like SOS lights. I slowed down and proceeded with caution. Upon getting closer, I saw a car parked in the middle of the road, seemingly deliberately to block traffic, along with 2 cones placed on either side and 2 SOS lights flashing on the ground. Then, 2 hooded men of African American descent came from behind the car and started walking over to us. I put the car in reverse, ready to hightail it back the other way. One of the men came over to my window, and I cracked it open just enough to hear him speak. After asking him if he needed something, he said, "Yes, open the door." I shut the window, and that's when he began to reach for something in his pocket. I put the car back in drive and hit the gas. I drove over the cone and SOS light and past their car. About 1 minute later, I saw a pair of headlights coming up fast behind us. At this point, my wife was awake, confused and questioning me about the speed we were moving at. I told her not to make any loud noises before telling her that we were being followed. The car behind us began flashing its lights. And then there was a loud pop, and I felt the car losing control. I did the best I could to bring it under control, but there was a second loud pop, and the car began to drag. I told my wife to call 911, even though it was probably already too late. By now my kids were up, scared and complaining. I kept the car moving for as long as possible, but the car following us began ramming our trunk. My kids were crying, my wife was screaming at the police. I was sure we were dead. But by some stroke of luck, or more like a miracle, I heard a siren and saw red and blue flashing lights coming up in the distance behind our chasers. They veered off to the exit that we happened to be passing at that moment, and the police car followed them. I pulled over to the side of the road, took the phone away from my wife, and told the police everything. Upon inspection, I found out that our 2 back tires were blown, probably shot at, which I also told the police. 10 minutes later, a squad pulled up behind us, along with a AAA truck. They seemed rather thrilled to inform us that they caught the 2 men. Someone else had stumbled onto their little roadblock trap, but luckily managed to turn around and escape before calling the cops. When my sister was in her 20s, she was on vacation with her now husband, and one of their destinations was St. Martin. They had rented a car to get around and such. One day while doing sightseeing, they were on some side road that was rather isolated from any buildings or signs of civilization. It was a nice scenic route to take, but other than that, my sister tells me that it was a pretty dead road, so it probably didn't lead anywhere important. They eventually came up to something odd. There was the back of a car sticking out of the crops on the side of the road. As they pulled up closer, they could see it was some unbranded rusty neon blue car that had seemingly swerved into the crops. My sister's husband pulled up and stopped the car, telling my sister to wait in the car. He got out to check it out. From what my sister tells me, her husband looked through all the windows of the car for anybody at all. She watched as he then looked down and jumped back at something. She then got out of the car to see what was wrong. They both got down low to have a look underneath the rusty old car. What they saw was horrifying. There were 2 grown men with large knives in their hands, along with a bloody dead body laying between them. My sister's husband literally pushed her all the way back to the car and shoved her into her seat. The 2 men had crawled out from under the car and were now on their feet. He made it back into the car just in time to drive off down the road. They stopped at the nearest sign of civilization, making sure they weren't being followed, and called the police. Both of them seem to get uneasy when the topic is brought up, so we try not to remind them of it, but I can tell my sister has always been a bit different ever since this happened to her. I was 16 years old and the summer had just started. Our grandparents were treating the whole family to a 10-day cruise. It was a Royal Caribbean cruise, and we were going to Florida and the Bahamas. It was me, my 2 brothers, my sister and her boyfriend, my parents, my aunt and uncle, my 2 cousins, and my grandparents. I spent most of my time hanging out with my older brother, Rob, who was 20. We got to share a room together, even though it really wasn't allowed. We just claimed that our dad was staying with us in that room. So one night, me and my brother were in the nightclub of the ship. I snuck in using someone else's ship ID card. When I was in there, I noticed some older, creepy-looking man sitting by the wall, and I was sure he was staring intently at me. I made a point of moving around to see if he was really looking at me, and his head turned to face me wherever I went. I was feeling really uncomfortable, so I left right then and there. I coincidentally found my sister and her boyfriend sitting by the bar outside of the club. I sat down with them for a bit, and a few moments later, I saw the same man from in the club, now out by the bar, sitting across the room, and he was still staring at me. I looked away and pretended not to notice, but my heart was racing at this point. I contemplated whether or not to tell my sister, but I ended up not telling her. I don't know why. I left the bar and started speed walking back to my room. When I got to the stateroom halls, I was constantly glancing over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't being followed. I got to my room safely. I was extremely creeped out. I had a feeling this guy was some sort of perverted creep. I got a knock at the door, and I got a little nervous. I looked through the peephole and saw my brother, so I let him in. I did not see the strange man again until late the next night. My brother and I went with my sister and her boyfriend to one of the restaurants on board at like 1 in the morning. They weren't planning on going to sleep anytime soon, so I told them I was going to crash, and I walked back to the stateroom. But when I got there, I saw that the door to our room was cracked open a bit and the light was on. I knew for sure we shut the door when we left, and there was no chance room service was in there at an hour like this. I proceeded with extreme caution and slowly pushed the door open completely. There was nobody in the room. I checked the bathroom, but it was empty too. All of our stuff was still in the same spot that I remembered it was in. I kind of just figured maybe Rob came back to the room for some reason when I wasn't with him and forgot to shut the door, so I just went to sleep. I woke up to darkness and the feeling of something brushing against my cheek. It was a hand. I pushed it away, telling Rob to knock it off, but when I noticed, even in the dark, beyond the figure by my bed, that Rob was in his bed, I let out the most blood-curdling scream you have ever heard. Rob jumped up and turned the lamp on, and there was the man from the club standing next to me. Rob jumped on him and began throwing punches. I joined in and we took down the man. It wasn't even a minute before frantic knocking came at the door. It was my parents. My dad held down the man while we called the customer service center. They sent up 2 security workers and he was sent to the jail of the ship for the remainder of the cruise. I'm not sure what happened to him afterwards, but this has emotionally scarred me, and I don't think I can ever go on another cruise again. When somebody goes hunting, they're normally right smack in the middle of a forest or the woods, completely devoid of other people. Seems like the perfect setting for a horror story, right? These 3 supposedly true stories will show you just what can go wrong while hunting. This first story was submitted to me in June by somebody named Robert Scherneman. His story takes place upstate New York, a place I'm familiar with. Here's his story. I've been a passionate hunter ever since my dad before me started taking me out on trips every Saturday, and I thought I would pass down the same tradition to my son. During the setting of this story, my son Peter was 10 years old. I figured that was a good age to introduce him to the world of hunting. I armed Peter and myself with Remington Model 798 sniper rifles, however I carried it until I found the spot where I usually find game. We could have used the deer hunting tower hidden deeper in the woods, but I figured that wouldn't be the best first-time experience. I handed him the gun when we were set up. I had already taught him the basics of firearms, so it wasn't like I was taking him out there with no experience. I chose to stay put the first time as it would be easier for him, and I figured I would move up to the more advanced methods of hunting in the future sessions. There was a lot of waiting, more waiting than usual in this certain spot. I could see Peter was getting bored, constantly yawning and sighing, and that disappointed me. I didn't want him to think this sport was that boring, so I packed up our stuff and told him we're moving. He seemed to perk up a bit with excitement, and that made me happy. As soon as we began walking, I heard footsteps. I put my arm in front of Peter silently and motioned for him to raise his gun. He did with excitement, until I spotted someone's head peer out from around a tree in the distance. I pushed the gun down immediately, a bit disappointed, but also relieved that Peter didn't shoot. I gave him a quick little apologetic wave, and with that, he disappeared back behind the tree out of sight. Was he another hunter? I couldn't tell, but from what I saw of him, even in the distance, there was something off-putting about his face. I couldn't put my finger on what it was at that moment. Seeing somebody this deep into the woods was rare and also strange, and this guy didn't exactly look like a hunter. So, as a safety precaution, I suppose, I steered Peter in the other direction. Still no sign of any deer. Peter asked me about the man, like who I thought he was, for example, as expected, and I just told him I didn't know, and I didn't think we should get closer. I didn't want to lie to him. A few minutes later, Peter started complaining that he was hungry. I was getting pretty hungry myself, so we stopped and unpacked our snacks. I was extremely disappointed that nothing had happened by now. While eating my sandwich, I heard footsteps again in the distance. Peter did too, as he immediately picked up his rifle and pointed it in that direction. I felt my heart drop when I could see the same man from before peering out from another tree at us. I lowered Peter's gun again, and I noticed he seemed a bit uncomfortable now, as was I. I told him to wait there while I began to walk over to the man, trying to emotionally prepare myself to confront him. About halfway over, I stopped and thought to myself, what the hell am I doing? My son is right over there. I turned around and hurried back to Peter, telling him it's time to go. If you had your son in the middle of the woods and you thought you were being stalked, odds are you would just want to get out of there too. We were not running, we were merely walking back to the road. I was mentally waiting for a twig snap or a leaf crunch from behind us, and when it happened, I nudged Peter to go along ahead. I angrily turned around and stormed towards the man, who was once again peering from behind a tree. I'd say when I got within 30 feet from the tree, he moved back behind the tree out of sight, and then I heard a thud, as if something were just dropped onto the ground. I had my gun loaded in my hand as I cautiously walked up to the tree. I didn't even say a word. I don't know why. All I did was slowly creep up to the tree, and when I got there, I felt as if everything around me had completely collapsed, or rather ceased to exist, and all that I could focus on was the head laying face first on the ground in front of me. No body, just head. I didn't even look up or around the tree to see who had dropped it there. I just full on sprinted back to Peter and told him to run. We made it back home safely within 5 minutes, and I made 100% sure we weren't followed. However, I stayed up the whole night keeping watch for the sake of my family's safety. I found out the next day through my wife that there had been 2 disappearances of local hunters, and that's when I called the police and reported what I had experienced. I had to, of course, play it safe for a long time, at least a few months, before taking my son out again. What baffles me, though, is how this person managed to kill 2 hunters who obviously had to be armed with some kind of weapon. I have since resumed hunting with my son. The next story was submitted to me just a month ago by Nathan Zielinski, and it's more of a mix between a camping and a hunting story. Here it is. It was my first time hunting. I was 21, going with my friends Anthony, Christian, Tom, and his girlfriend Diana to some park in Colorado to go elk hunting. We brought 2 separate tents that were relatively large, sleeping bags, 2 days worth of food and drinks, and of course, guns. I couldn't even tell you the name of the gun Anthony handed me. It was just a basic looking hunting rifle. Honestly, I didn't know how I felt about the whole thing. Killing a living, breathing animal that has just as much of a will to live as me, merely for so-called fun, didn't seem cool to me. But it was like the 5th time Anthony offered, and I felt like I had to say yes. I decided I wouldn't shoot any animals about halfway through the car ride. Anthony pulled into a lot, we unpacked the car, and proceeded to hike about a mile into the woods before setting up camp. First thing after setting up camp, we all followed Anthony's lead as he proudly babbled on about hunting techniques. I wished I had someone to laugh about it with, but everyone else seemed serious about it as well. I tried busting Anthony's chops by asking him, wouldn't it be better to stop talking if you don't want to scare away any potential prey? He got pissed. I could tell he took this really seriously, and from there on, I shut up. And by there on, I mean however long things were going normal, and that wasn't long. During our hunt, we ran into a rather strange group of people. 3 rather large, dirty men with long, sticky hair. They looked like they belonged to some kind of inbreeding house deep in the woods. They looked at us and sort of nodded their heads as if to say hello as we passed by them, one by one. We were officially freaked out. It might sound like something that would be laughable, but under the circumstances, it was horrifying. We were deep in the woods, far from the lot, which was, for the record, completely empty, and it may sound exaggerated, but these 3 looked like creepy lowlives who could be dangerous. Thankfully, though, they didn't follow us, which allowed for us to peacefully go on with our hunt. Anthony ended up killing a deer. We didn't find any elks. We dragged the deer all the way back to our campsite, and that was actually our dinner for the night. Anthony and Tom went through a disgusting, bloody process of skinning, and I'm pretty sure gutting the deer, but I didn't watch for more than a few seconds. Anthony made us venison burgers. He came prepared with the buns and everything. While I didn't particularly agree with the sport, I was impressed with Anthony. We went to sleep first thing at dark with the fire still going outside. I was having a really bad time trying to get comfortable in that sleeping bag. Anthony and Christian seemed to fall asleep quickly, while I, on the other hand, had to be rolling around for at least 2 hours. I've always had a hard time falling asleep in sleeping bags. I was actually about to get up and go outside to pee when I heard footsteps coming from outside the tent. I opened my mouth to call out Tom or Diana's name, but I realized, what if it wasn't them? I laid silently and listened. In an unexpected instant, the zipper to our tent got pulled down, and I threw my head down to the side and acted as if I were asleep. There was a short pause before the zipper got pulled back up. I waited until the pairs of footsteps moved away. They seemed to be moving to Tom and Diana's tent. Then I realized it must have been them, and they must have been checking if we were asleep so they could, mess around, I guess. So I decided to play a little joke on them. I gave it about 5 minutes before I unzipped the tent and began creeping over to their tent. Then I realized their zipper was still undone. That's strange, I thought to myself. I crept over expecting to scare the 2 lovebirds, but instead, when I got close enough, I saw 2 men inside of the tent doing something to Diana. At that moment, I screamed as loud as I could, mostly out of fear, but also to wake everyone up. Anthony and Christian stormed out from the tent with their rifles. When the 2 men fled from the tent, I realized something. They were the same 2 men we had seen earlier. Tom and Anthony fired rounds in their direction to scare them off. However, something even more horrifying happened after that. After they shot their rounds, we all looked around us completely horrified as men in almost all directions who were previously hiding in bushes and behind trees were taking off in different directions. We tried waking up Tom and Diana, but they seemed to have been injected with some kind of tranquilizers by the men. We had no choice but to wait until they woke up, which took about maybe half an hour. Running back to the car in that pitch-black forest was one of the most horrifying moments of my life. We don't know who all those people were. They could have been part of some secluded inbreeding house for all we knew, or even some kind of cannibalistic family. We have no idea what they were planning on doing with Tom and Diana, but we're just happy we all got out of there safely. This last story was written by Jared the Sprinter, and he shares his night hunting experience. I was doing some night hog hunting in the woods near my backyard. I was hiding in the tower I had built about a decade ago. In case anyone's wondering, I of course had a night vision scope attachment. I guess I'm what you would consider a hardcore hunter. I don't want to bore you with the unnecessary story prolonging details, so I'll make this short. And I want everyone to know that though I agree this story sounds far-fetched and crazy, it is nothing but the truth. And I, in a way, actually consider myself lucky that I'll always have such a horrifying story to share. So, while I was sitting in the tower waiting for movement, it finally came. I took aim and found the source. But it wasn't at all a hog, or any kind of animal I was expecting. It was a person, a man wearing all black. Black sweatpants, black shoes, and a black hoodie with the hood over his head. But that wasn't the freakiest part. He was dragging a sack behind him. My heart started racing. I was pretty sure I was witnessing this guy trying to bury a body. I continued to watch him, but then he slowed down, and I swear to God, it looked as if he turned his head up to me. I ducked down under the wooden walls of the tower, shaking in my boots. Yes, I had a gun, but just the idea of using it against a person is horrifying. I lay low, praying to God that he hadn't seen me. It wouldn't make sense if he could, though. It's practically pitch black out here, or at least that was my logic. Seconds felt like an eternity as I waited for the footsteps in the leaves to move elsewhere, but I didn't hear any footsteps. All I heard was the sound of a foot hitting one of the wooden planks on the ladder of the tower. I felt the entire tower vibrate and shake as there were 2 more steps moving up the ladder. At this point, I was asking myself deep down, am I going to be able to shoot someone? But for some reason, whoever was down there decided not to climb all the way up, as I heard them jump back down to the forest ground and began dragging the sack away. I think I stayed frozen like a statue for at least 10 minutes before even peeking over the ledge again. The coast seemed clear. I had to get home and warn the police immediately. I hopped over the ledge and descended down the ladder. I turned on my pocket flashlight, which in hindsight was a stupid move considering the situation, and ran back in the direction of my house. I was only able to run for about 10 seconds or so when I heard the rapid, manic footsteps crunching the leaves from behind me. I took a look over my shoulder, and there he was, inches away from my face. I spun around and shot him in the shoulder. He stopped and screamed in agony, and I took that moment to finish my dash to my house. Again, in hindsight, I should have held him hostage somehow, but that doesn't even matter now. I called the police, who showed up within 15 minutes with a whole search squad, and I led them all into the woods to the exact location where I shot him. There was a faint yet noticeable blood trail spilled onto the leaves, which led past the body bag, which the cops seized, and eventually right to the maniac, who was hiding under a log next to a tree. He was arrested and tried for the murder of Jinkwen Sakanaki, a Japanese corner store owner. I don't know the full story behind it, but I do know I won't forget this one for the rest of my life, and I'll also be telling it for the rest of my life.
When I was 17, I moved to college 2 hours away from home and took residence in the dorms on campus. The dorms were not run through the school, but through a management company. As a result, there were a lot of safety problems: assaults, ODs, drugs, shootings right outside, etc. I am a 100-pound female, so I always watched out for serious situations around me. Everything was great. I had some awful roommates, but I was mostly left alone. One day in September, I was leaving for class early in the morning when I spotted a condom taped to my name tag on the door. It had a note that said, "Call me XOXO," with a random phone number. I told the RAs, and nothing came of it. I just thought it was some random prank pulled by one of the guys on the floor. Things went south with my roommates, mostly because of my night terrors scaring them, even though I warned them before we even agreed to be roommates. So, I was moved into a 2-bedroom dorm with my new roommate, Jay. We each had our own room. After a week of living there, I started noticing that things were appearing in the living room while we were sleeping. I asked Jay about it, and she vehemently denied it was her. One day, we noticed that the lock on the front door did not lock properly. If you pulled on the lock and twisted the handle at the same time, the door would come open. Around the same time, I started getting Snapchats of inappropriate things, vague threats, and offers for great sex. I would get ones that said things like, "You look great today," with that specific article of clothing I was wearing. I filed a report to the dorms to get the lock fixed, but it took 4 months, 8 complaints, the threat of legal action, and my friend D yelling at them to get any action. We got our door fixed, but the presence still appeared outside of the door with notes for me. I was still receiving Snapchats, but I moved out of the dorms into an apartment with my then boyfriend. The Snapchats continued. Then I started getting calls at my work. I worked for the dean's office of my college, and I was in charge of answering phones. Every day, I would get 3 or more calls from randomly generated numbers. Discovered it was through apps like Viber and Skype after I reported it to the police and they investigated. I would answer the phone. "Class Dean's office, how may I help you?" I would hear heavy breathing for a few seconds, then they would hang up. I thought it was just some 12-year-old pranking our office until my coworker got a call. She answered with her name, and the person on the line asked if they could speak with me. Thinking it was one of the deans that I had been working with, she forwarded it to my phone. I answered and received the same heavy breathing and hang-up. I reported it to my boss. She did nothing. One of the deans overheard the conversation and reported it to Title IX. Oh boy, talking to them was a mistake. After the meeting with them, the threats started getting worse, and this person found me in my new apartment. One day in December, I was dog-sitting 2 wonderful dogs who hated other dogs and would bark at them on sight. It was around 11 p.m., and I decided to take them out before bed. We got outside, and to the right of me was a bunch of thick trees that were hard to see through. I started to take the girls to the grass on the left. They started growling and barking at something in the trees. Thinking it was another dog, I tried to pull them away, but they would not budge. I glanced over, and out of the trees came a tall man, but the weird thing was, he was wearing a Michael Myers-like mask. He started rushing towards me. The dogs got between me and him. He stopped. I ran up the stairs behind me into the apartment as he disappeared into the trees again. Stupidly, I didn't call the police, but I saw him one more time before I moved to my new apartment. Things were quiet for a while. My boyfriend and I broke up, and I spent the first few days in the new apartment alone. Come to find out, the window that can be accessed from the ground doesn't lock. One morning I woke up. Everything seemed normal. I checked the mirror to do my hair for work. I had a bald spot. My head was shaved in the middle of the night. I found my hair tied up in knots in an envelope. I immediately called the police. They did an investigation, found the window was broken, but couldn't find anything to figure out who it was that came into my apartment. They asked me to compile a list of everything that was missing, and the only thing gone, other than my hair, were 3 pairs of dirty underwear. I have photos of the hair and bald spot, if anyone is interested. The investigation found no one. I have since moved. I no longer answer phones at work, and I keep bear spray next to my bed at all times. I'm a 32-year-old female. This happened to me when I was about 25 or 26. I work full-time as a researcher at a university, which is where these encounters took place. I'm not a professor or anything, and because of my age at the time, I could have easily been mistaken for just another student wandering around campus. On some days, when the weather was nice, I would prefer to spend my lunch hour strolling around the university grounds outside, or sitting underneath a shady tree on a bench, enjoying the time I was not sitting in a cramped corner of a lab. On one of these days, I was sitting on a bench enjoying the fresh air, and a male student walking by asked if he could sit next to me. I'm a pretty shy and awkward kind of person, so even though I would have preferred sitting alone, I said, "Sure." He initiated simple conversation, to which I obliged, but I was careful not to be too forthcoming. He mentioned he had seen which departmental building I came and went from, which slightly alarmed me, given I had never seen this person before in my life. But I pushed the thought from my mind. After all, the weather had been decent lately, and I had spent nearly all my lunch hours for the past week outside. He asked if I was studying within the mentioned department, to which I told him that I was not a student, but rather I worked there. He told me he was an engineering student, and then followed up with asking me out to coffee sometime. I apologized and told him that I had a boyfriend and would have to decline. We parted ways after that, and I assumed I probably wouldn't see him around again. About a week or two went by, and I was spending another lunch hour outside on campus, sitting on a different bench somewhere. Seemingly out of nowhere, the same man from before asked if he could sit next to me again. Admittedly, I don't remember what he started talking to me about at first. My mind was reeling, and I was rather uncomfortable having to potentially turn this guy down a second time. Sure enough, he asked me again if we could go out for coffee sometime. I apologized and reminded him that I had a boyfriend and would not be meeting him for coffee. And again, he left after that. I was feeling rather anxious now, but it still hadn't reached a level where I felt I had to be too concerned. A few days later, I had finished work and was leaving the building to walk to where I had parked my car. The university charges a fortune for parking passes, even if you're employed by them. So I had always opted for free street parking about a 10-minute walk away from campus. My walking route would take me down several quiet residential streets with minimal car traffic. Even pedestrian traffic was pretty sparse on the busiest of days. It wasn't until I was about halfway to my car, down one of these quiet back streets, that I noticed someone walking directly across the street from me, but keeping a few paces behind. I noticed him from my peripheral vision and didn't want to flat out turn around to stare at him. It wasn't uncommon to see someone else by any means. I was just always trying to be aware of my surroundings when walking the streets alone. I had to make a few turns coming up anyway, and the chance that they would be going the same way as me was slim. But he did. He made all the turns I did, still walking on the sidewalk across from me, a few steps behind. I still did not want to look at whoever this was. I didn't want him to know that I was aware of what I thought he was doing. I quickened my pace to a speedy walk. I was approaching the first of two busier streets before I would reach my car. His pace quickened to keep up with me. That was the moment I panicked. The moment I was sure that he was indeed following me. After that, I started a full-out jog to cross the first of the busier streets. He ran to keep up behind me and was now on the same side of the street I was. I was now nearly at my car. I had to cross the last busy street and get about 100 meters, and I would be there. But it was crossing the street that worried me. I often had to stop and wait a good minute or so before it was clear enough to do so. If this were the case, he would catch up with me. As if the stars aligned, as soon as I made it running to the busy street, I had a gap to cross. I booked it as fast as I could, finally turning around once I had made it, to look and yell at the man who had been pursuing me. It was him. I could have suspected, but now it was confirmed. It was the engineering student whom I had turned down for coffee. "Stop following me!" I yelled at him from across the busy street. "Can I just talk to you?" he yelled back. I didn't even answer him. I mean, the answer should have been obvious from the start, and I was certainly never going to give my time to anyone who had just followed and then chased me for about 1 kilometer. I kept moving quickly to my car, so determined to get the hell out of there that I didn't even care if he saw which car was mine. He had given up following me and never tried to cross the road, to my relief. I got home and broke down. I mean, worse things had happened to other people, no doubt, and I was not harmed, fortunately. but I was shaken. I had some anxieties walking to and from work after that. It wasn't long before a coworker and I would walk most of the distance back to our cars together after work. I even changed where I started parking for a time. A few weeks had passed since the incident, and I had not seen him around campus at all. I had started spending my lunches in the lab instead of outside, but occasionally I would go to the student center to buy lunch instead. This one particular day, the food court in the student center was packed, almost shoulder to shoulder. I was standing in line at a burger stall, and I heard a guy try to get someone's attention through the crowd. I looked up, and it was him again, waving to me and trying to make his way through the people. I panicked, and even though I'm terribly shy, I started a scene and yelled at him to leave me the fuck alone. His face dropped instantly as people stared at us, and he slinked back into the sea of students. My heart was pounding, and I was shaking. I don't even remember if I ended up getting food after that. I went back to work, and from then on, was even more focused on my surroundings than I ever was before. It's been 5 or 6 years since then now, and I still work at the university. I'm so relieved to say I never saw him again after the food court, and haven't had any other harrowing accounts on campus. I'm still diligent about being aware of my surroundings, especially when I have to walk to and from campus alone. I never asked the guy his name, so I couldn't even report an incident to campus police or anything. All in all, I'm just glad I never saw him again, and I can only hope he never did this to any other girl before or after me. In high school, I had a stalker. Here's the story. I'll try to keep it concise, but there's a lot of information for sure. I was 16, and we met on Facebook. He went to a school nearby, and we decided to meet up for a movie. We had a great time together and ended up dating. First time he came to my parents' house, he had an ankle monitor on for house arrest, and wouldn't tell anyone why, and since he was a minor, we couldn't find out. My parents obviously didn't allow us to hang out, so we hung out at his house or around town at the YMCA camp. I was rebellious and naive. Things started to get weird when I noticed his family was pretty odd. One day, we were having sex in his bedroom, and I saw his father looking through the blinds. I screamed and called him out, and his dad ran off. Stalker guy told me that his dad was just into redheads and liked to watch us. I went to leave, and his mom was doing crack in the kitchen, so I decided it was time to break up. This is when it got bad. He started crying and told me that he's in cancer treatment, and that's why he needs me. He doesn't have long to live, blah blah blah. I believed him and told him we could be friends. This is when the stalking started. He switched schools to my high school, but never went to class. He would just stand outside of my classroom, looking inside until it was passing period. When I would leave class, he wouldn't address me. He would just follow about 10 to 15 feet behind me to my next period and stand outside the classroom again. I was too intimidated to say something to him. He was 6'4" and a heavy-set guy, so I just let it happen for weeks. It started to progress to where he would follow me home every day. He would get on the same bus as me, despite living across town, and walk 15 feet behind me all the way to my house. He would stand outside, just staring up at the window, until around the time my parents got home, and then he would just leave. Finally, I told him to fuck off and leave me alone. I told him we could no longer be friends or acquaintances and to forget about me. However, that escalated things way further. I started getting about 150 calls a night. Half of them were him screaming death threats and in-detail torture methods that he wanted to do to me, and the other half were him singing me love songs that he wrote on his guitar. Every time I blocked his number, he seemed to just magically get a new one and leave more messages on that. I woke up one day to see that overnight, he had left me one of those dancing and singing snowmen on my porch. He had stabbed it in the head and the knife was still sticking out. He covered it in his liquid deodorant that I had previously mentioned liking the smell of. and I noticed there was a hole where the little song recording device was. When I pressed the hand, it was not the regular Frosty the Snowman song that played. It was his voice, singing eerily, "I'm going to have you forever. I'm never going to let you be." I was done at this point and told my parents, who contacted the school. They suspended him, but he still waited at my bus stop every day and walked to my home with me. One day he ran at me like he was going to tackle me. When I tensed up for the impact, he stopped and hugged me. It wasn't a regular hug. It was like he was trying to crush me. I was 5'1" and about 90 pounds at the time, and he ended up cracking one of my ribs. I cried and he started crying too before running off. He left me a voicemail apologizing in song. This one night is the night I'll never forget, and it's the reason we got a restraining order, and my dad got a gun. I woke up one evening for no reason, just was fully awake. I got up to go to my kitchen to get a glass of water to relax, and in the reflection on my fridge, I saw movement in my backyard. I couldn't see well because it was so dark outside and so light inside, so I went to the back sliding glass door to get a better look. When I got closer, I was met with the silhouette of a 6'4" man standing just outside the door. Stalker guy was in my backyard, under my room at 3 a.m. He was just staring at me. I yelled and my parents got up, but he was gone by the time my dad went outside. There's a patio right outside my bedroom window that goes all the way to the ground, so it's possible he could have been on top of the patio looking directly into my bedroom window before. We got a restraining order granted shortly after that, and Stalker guy dropped out of school. I haven't seen him since in person, but every 6 months, he makes a new Facebook and tries to friend request me. I just block it and report it every time. Scary stuff. Y'all ever heard of that myth that if you wake up in the middle of the night for no reason, there's likely something looking at you? Well, maybe it's true. I don't know what he's doing now or where he went, but I don't care to know. I was born and raised in Texas, but had moved to New York when I was 21. So when I found out at the beginning of a week-long trip that I'd have a couple of overnights in Austin, I was super excited to go to my home state for a few days. My brother lived just north of the city, and we planned to hang out and go to dinner the night I arrived when he got off work. The following day, we were going to meet up with our dad, who lived about an hour away. I got to the hotel downtown, the crew and I checked in, and then we each headed off to our rooms. After a short elevator ride, I got to my room, and not even 5 minutes later, there was a loud, hard knock on the door. It was only around 1 or 2 p.m., and I hadn't called either my dad or brother to let them know I was in town yet, so they wouldn't know what room I was in. I assumed it was maybe one of my crewmates, so I headed to the door. Before even making it to the door, however, a loud male voice on the other side boomed, "The front desk sent me about the bathroom problem you called in," before trying to open the door. "Unlock the door and open up, miss. I need in now." I froze in my tracks. I hadn't even been in the bathroom yet, let alone called anything into the front desk. I'm a petite chick, and while I take no shit from anyone despite my size, I still err on the side of caution. Slowly inching toward the door to look out the peephole, all I could tell was that the man on the other side was at least 6 feet tall and easily over double my weight. No way in hell was I going to unlock the door. I responded to the guy, telling him he must have had the wrong room. He continued pounding on the door while constantly turning the handle, telling me no, he needed in and was getting in the room one way or another. I panicked, but thankfully had the sense to grab the phone and call the front desk. The concierge confirmed that they had neither sent anyone up to my room nor received a call about the bathroom. The entire time, this guy was still determined to get in my room, pounding and yelling. Lucky for me, the front desk had dispatched security to my floor. When the security officers stepped off the elevator a few seconds later, I could hear them in the hall approach and ask the guy who he was, what he was doing, and telling him he needed to leave the hotel. He immediately got hostile and aggressive toward them, and the front desk clerk I was still on the phone with told me the police had been called and were on their way. In the meantime, I was trapped in my room, scared shitless. Long story short, the cops showed up pretty quickly and managed to arrest the guy for trespassing and criminal menacing or some shit. I later found out that the guy was also wanted in connection to a string of break-ins and violent sexual assaults in Austin. He had seen and stalked me from the minute I entered the hotel lobby. Apparently, I was exactly his type of victim. Nothing else happened after that, but it still rattled the fuck out of me for the rest of my stay in that hotel.